Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Reverend Rachel Knuth, Associate Minister of Congregational Care. And on behalf of the Community Church of Sebastopol, I want to welcome you to this special event where we are so honored and thrilled to host author Rosemary Manchester in conversation with Reverend Dr. Benjamin Broadbent, our lead minister. Rosemary and Pastor Benjamin will be discussing her book, Turn Left at the Big Anthill. It is a beautifully crafted memoir that tells the story of Rosemary's time in the Belgian Congo with 4 small children, where she and her family served as missionaries from 1958 to 1963. The format of our time together will be a conversation between Pastor Benjamin and Rosemary, with an opportunity for audience questions at the end. Please join us for a reception of cookies and lemonade in the courtyard outside following the presentation. This event is being live streamed and recorded and will be publicly available on the church's YouTube channel. Signed copies of Rosemary's book are available for purchase, with all proceeds today going to the Adult Mission Trip Fund. The Adult Mission Trip in recent years has traveled to fire-ravaged towns in Northern California to help rebuild homes. Thank you, Rosemary, for your generosity and support of this important mission work in service to our neighbors. And a few logistics before we begin. To keep everyone as safe as possible, a reminder to please keep your mask covering your nose and mouth. Restrooms are in the narthex by the entrance. And some thank yous. Thanks to Jane Hunnicky for managing book sales. Thanks to Kathy Matthews for hosting the reception afterwards. Thanks to our tech person, Erin Knuth, who's managing sound and live streaming this event. Thanks to all of you for being here, and to our online viewers. Thanks to Pastor Benjamin for your thoughtful questions. And thanks to Rosemary Manchester for your excellent memoir. You are truly a gift to us and to our world, and we are so grateful to be able to celebrate alongside you today. Now I present to you Pastor Benjamin in conversation with Rosemary Manchester.
Thank you, Pastor Rachel, and I'll just add my welcome to all of you here at the Community Church of Sebastopol. And this idea kind of was hatched in Rosemary's living room because I couldn't wait to have this conversation, so I came and visited with you in person.
Yes.
And then we said, hey, we should do this again and maybe include some more people.
Of course.
So here we are. And so if Rosemary and I seem to be at various moments in this conversation in a little bubble, it's because we're just imagining ourselves in her living room having the conversation that we were having before.
Right.
But we do want all of you to be part of it. And after we engage in a conversation for a while, you'll have a chance to ask your questions.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'd like to welcome all of you, and I have some special people who are here. First of all, I want to introduce my teacher and coach and her husband, the proofreader. This is Sky Blaine and Owen Bloom. Will you take a bow? Without those two people, this wouldn't have happened. I was having a really hard time finishing this book, and Sky and Bea helped me so much. Thank you, thank you. There are several members of the memoir class here. Wave your hand so we'll know who you are. The memoir class is called the Cottage Memoirists because we used to meet in the Luther Burbank Cottage at the Experimental Farm. And we're looking forward to the day when we can once more. But in the meantime, we Zoom every Tuesday morning from 9:30 till about noon. And it's a wonderful class with a wonderful teacher. It's just amazing. I want to thank the people from Burbank Heights and Orchards who are here. It's lovely of you to come. And the people from the church, thank you for your support. Did I miss anybody? Okay. Back to you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Rosemary, I wonder if you would just start by, if you were to just kind of share with somebody who maybe isn't familiar with the book yet, and were to just share kind of basically what it's about. Give us an overview of that. I just wanted to give you a chance to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's about me. When I was young and foolish, I went with my 4 little children and my husband to the Belgian Congo to be missionaries of the United Methodist Church. I was 30 years old and thought I knew something, and now I know how very little I knew when I was 30. And we lived first of all, we spent a year in Belgium working on our French. And then in the Congo, we lived in the Katanga province, which is in the southern part of Congo. It's where all the rich minerals are, and was the most enviable part of the Congo as far as the rest of the world is concerned. Our life there exploded when the country declared its independence, and war broke out and is still going on. The city in which we lived was called Jadotville. A couple of weeks ago, the front page of the New York Times had a big picture of the cobalt works at Fungarumi. Now, when I lived there, Fungarumi was just a little junction down the road. I think we might have had a school there, but now it's the whole world is looking at it. And the sad thing is, electric cars are wonderful, but they can't operate without cobalt. So once more, are stuck in a situation where the thing that everybody wants is in Congo, but the people in the Congo will probably not see any of the rewards from the riches that are being ripped out of the country. It's a sad story. After independence was declared, war was pretty much constant from then on out. And that gives you just a picture it in time. It was so long ago that I always want to start by saying, once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, because some of you weren't even born yet in those days. So that's enough, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mm-hmm. I'll just point out, Rosemary, most of us weren't born back in those days. So, but you've helpfully drawn a thread between the experiences that you share in this book and the experiences that continue there today. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering about this book. Those of us who have known you for any amount of time, we know that this has been a labor of love, mm-hmm. which means there's a lot of love put in here, but there's also a lot of labor. Can you talk to us about, what did it take for you to get to the point where this got published? How long did it take? What was the hardest part about it? How did we get to this point where you've now published this book?
Well, it took 30 years. I retired when I was 62 and moved up here to Sonoma County and started doing what I'd wanted all my life to learn to do, and that was to learn to write. I had a story I wanted to tell, but I wanted to write it in such a way that people I didn't even know would be willing to read it. So that's how I got started 30 years ago. I went to workshops, I went to classes, I went to book events, I went to graduate school, and kept working on the art of writing. It's not an easy art to learn. You must be diligent. You must be untiring. You must be willing to do it over and over and over again until you get it the way you finally want it to be. It really helps to have very good teaching, very good coaching, and also helps to have an excellent proofreader when you get ready to publish. It's hard work. I think one of the things that helped me actually was the pandemic. I couldn't go anywhere. I don't have a car. There I was, me and the computer. So I thought, well, all right, I might as well get to work and see if I can finally finish this thing. So you've written, Ben, you know what hard work it is, right?
Yeah, I also think, this is a memoir, and what's unique about a memoir is that it's about you and your life and a formative experience you had in your life. And it can only be written with some distance between the experience you had and now.
Yeah, good point.
And so you had learned some things. You'd come to some new insights. It strikes me that, as you mentioned, you thought you knew something at age 30. You had an idea of what it meant to go and be a missionary.
Yes.
And through your experience, that idea of what it means to be a missionary, the value of that, the model of that changed for you. Can you talk about how that model of being a missionary and how your attitude toward it changed from when you began this adventure to now?
I grew up in a church-oriented family. I was carried into the church when I was in my mother's womb. She was in charge of the Sunday school. My father was the church treasurer. We were definitely Presbyterian church people. And the highest calling was to be a missionary. I caught that right away, the awe with which my mother especially regarded missionaries. And I always wanted to be the best at everything, and that seemed like it was the best thing to be. And so that had a lot to do with my eagerness to go overseas and serve. I kind of lost my train of thought.
Yeah, I was wondering how your idea of what it meant to be a missionary changed over time.
I had this somewhat exalted idea. If you've read the book, there's this place where I say I'd always imagined that I would be sitting under a palm tree with people gathered around me, listening to my words, and I would be telling them Bible stories. And it wasn't like that at all. When I went to the meetings of the Church Women's Society, I'd be sitting on the ground. Martha would be there. She was very small then. She'd have her little basket with her crayons and her coloring book and maybe a couple of kittens to amuse her. And the ants would be crawling around, and it was uncomfortable. And my language study was never easy. With 4 children, it's hard to block out the time to learn a language. And so I was never quite certain, and I'd suddenly be called upon to preach or pray. And it was really not a very enjoyable thing to be after all. I was disillusioned about the life of a missionary. And then I got in some difficulty with the powers that be in New York, with whom I often differed. And they were the decision makers, and I was the one trying to live with their decisions. I said to them early on when we first wanted to do this, I said, I'm the mother of 4 children, and that's my highest calling, and that's going to be my priority. Is that okay with you? Oh, yes, they said. Absolutely, we completely understand. The next thing they did was to tell my husband and I that we would be going to language school for the summer, so would we please find some place to park the children? So that reality dawned early. There'd be a lot of great talk, but too often that's all it would be just talk.
Yeah, you brought up your children, and it strikes me that the book is as much, if not more, about being a mother as it is about being a missionary. And it also strikes me that, not everyone would necessarily think it was the first thing that would come to their mind would be to take 4 young children to another country, cross the ocean with a different culture, a different kind of level of development within the country. But you did that.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, what were you thinking with regard to that? What led you to think, yeah, I think this would be a good idea, bring my 4 children to, what did you hope that they would get out of the experience?
Well, it's hard to explain. We were living in West Hartford, Connecticut, my husband's first parish. He was, up to his eyeballs, and he loved the work, And it was a church that the people had the Swedish background. And he soon learned what day all the different ladies made those lovely Swedish pastries and that Swedish coffee. So he would make his calls. And I was home in the parsonage with 4 little children, and the parsonage belonged to the church. And the church ladies were Swedish. You see the problem. They'd come over and there'd be Cheerios on the carpet, and they would tut-tut and say, no, really, you must do better. They picked out my furniture. They picked out the wallpaper. It was not a happy situation for me. And I often wonder how much that had to do with my deciding it would be better off to be in Africa. But I did have a mystical experience that I still can't find words to describe, so you'll just have to take my word for it. It was some mystical experience that made me realize that I had a calling to go to Africa and be a missionary. It was when I shared this with my husband, he said, well, don't you think that if we were meant to do that, that God would have called me? And I hadn't thought about it that way. But within a month, he came around, and he realized that there was the Lord's work to be done in Africa as well as in West Hartford, and there was a whole lot more people working that way in West Hartford than there were in Africa. So he agreed that that's what we would do.
It strikes me that what you thought you were signing up for did not play out in the way that you had expected, in a variety of ways, but including a civil war that broke out while you were there. And in your book, it's like these different things come together, this kind of desire to be about the missionary work, the desire to be the best mother in the circumstances that you were in, navigating your partnership with your husband at the time, and then the Civil War happens. There's actually a section I would love it if you'd read to us, if you wouldn't mind. It's on page 134.
Okay. Let's see what you picked.
Yeah, see what I
for
picked.
me.
I did not tell Rosemary about this ahead of time. Starting with the word sporadic gunfire. This is kind of in the. This is when things are really kind of getting.
This is
kind of hectic.
This is 1 week after independence was declared, and things rapidly began to fall apart. Sporadic gunfire punctuated the silence. Fires burned in the distance. Furtive crowds moved through the dark streets. Army trucks thundered by. In the light of a small candle found in the camping gear, I repacked our things for the plane. I put Stuart's things in a separate suitcase, a tacit acceptance that he might not go with us. I could always repack in the morning if it was to be a car journey. I couldn't decide what to wear. Isn't that crazy? Would slacks be acceptable if we flew straight home to the States? You want more?
Yeah, go a little further, yeah.
I listened to the quiet breathing of the sleeping children and waited for Stuart to come back from his patrol of the property. He came in, closed the door quietly, and locked it. I searched his face, dim in the light of the candle, for confirmation of his intentions, and found no hint of fear or apprehension. Everything's quiet out there, he said. Maybe it won't be so bad. If we have to leave, are you coming with us? He raised his eyebrows in surprise. You know I can't do that. Too many people depend on me here. I'll go back to Jadotville in the morning if I can get through. You and the kids go ahead if you want to. I'll join you as soon as I can. I bit down on my lower lip. We depended upon him too. This might be the last time I would see him. I didn't want to make a scene. He had never promised to go with us. We would go, and he would stay. His duty lay with the church, and my duty lay with the children. I was sick of duty. Duty left no room for love, fear, or sorrow. I felt torn in too. I couldn't imagine life without Stuart. He watched my face. He hoped I wouldn't get emotional and make a scene. I shook my head, blinked back the tears. We didn't touch each other. It was as though we were already worlds apart. We stared at each other. The phone rang. At least they didn't disconnect the phone, he said as he picked up the receiver. It was not the expected summons to the plane. The rebels had captured the airport. My fantasy flag-painted plane of deliverance evaporated. Stuart talked on, arranged details for the children and me to join the convoy to northern Rhodesia.
What I love about that section, it has all the tension in it. The tension of the violence and chaos happening around you, the tension between you and your husband, the tension within yourself about wanting to care for your kids, but wanting to do the right thing, not wanting to leave him. And I love the line, I was sick of duty. It reminded me, I think I told you this story when we were in your kitchen. At my former church, we would have these periodic dinners for, it was called the Silver Threads Luncheon. These were for folks in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And one time we had this, the theme was the 1950s. And so there were various memorabilia from the 1950s around. And there were two people who were asked to speak about their experience of being in the 50s, a man and a woman. The man got up and spoke, and he gave that kind of line of that kind of romantic idea of the 50s. There's the kind of post-war possibilities, the growth of the suburbs, all of the different pieces of pop culture that were coming into play, new opportunities and jobs and industries. He painted a certain picture of the 1950s where he, as a man, had a lot of wonderful opportunities. When he was finished, the woman came up, and she took a big breath, which ended with a sigh. And she said, the 1950s were awful. And she talked about, and it was just a beautiful juxtaposition of the tension between gender roles.
Yes.
I hear those in your account, and I hear you struggling with gender roles. On the one hand, wanting to play your best part in the family that you have created. On the other hand, feeling like you're being saddled with duty and silenced. And your needs were secondary to that of your husband and that of the men in charge. I mean, to what extent were you aware of that tension around gender roles in your writing of scenes like that?
Well, looking back on it, but at the time, I think that most of us women accepted our burden of home and children. And here's an interesting kind of a sidelight. When we signed up, the missionary man received a paycheck, and his wife was just expected to be an auxiliary to that, unpaid. Now, in my case, that was fine because I wasn't, I was a pretty bad missionary anyway, and I was focusing on the children. But the couples up in the bush, on those mission stations, their situation was entirely different. And most of those women worked full-time as missionaries and sent their children to boarding school, as eventually 2 of my children had to go to boarding school. And I don't remember any one of the women being upset or disturbed by the fact that they were unpaid labor. And something must have happened back in New York. Someone must have rattled their cage. And so the income of the male missionary was increased by 1/3 to cover compensation for the wife. And the paycheck still went to the man. Now, that gives you some idea of the position of women, particularly in relation to the church at that time, but in society, I think.
Yeah, I think Kathy's got some water for you, if you could use it.
Thank you. Thank you, sweetie.
You mentioned New York, and so you're referring to the United Methodist Mission Board,
Also known as the God Box.
as the God Box, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
there's a building that was an ecumenical building where many of the denominations had their mission boards and so forth. And there's a section in here that I'd like you to read, if you don't mind. You can take a sip of water if you need it, but it's on 318.
Oh, I know.
You know which one I'm pointing to? This is where after you've returned and you're starting to get resettled, but you're summoned to the God Box by the powers that be.
Yep.
And so I'm looking at the paragraph that starts, Stuart and I had one last obligation.
And what page are you?
318.
318.
318.
Okay. Oh dear, I was afraid you was asking this one. It doesn't want to come up.
Well, I love it because your fight comes out in this in these sentences.
Stuart and I
had one last obligation.
Okay. All right, so here we are in the God Box, facing the Grand Poobah of the United Mission of the United Methodist Church. And I mean, he's the head dude, and he was no fun at all. Stuart and I had one last obligation, our exit interview with the chairman of the board. That's him. I felt a bit shabby in the pristine lobby of the Interchurch Center on Riverside Drive in New York City. There hadn't been time to buy new clothes and shoes, and I needed a professional haircut. On my first visit to the center years ago, when this Africa business was all new, I'd been in awe of the marble walls, the bas-relief sculpture on the wall representing men in all aspects of the mission, preachers, doctors, teachers, evangelists. I'd hardly noticed the figure of a woman, her arms around some children. No longer in awe, I wondered how many churches Mr. Rockefeller could have built in the Congo for the price of all that marble. I kept these thoughts to myself. We were here on legitimate business. We had an appointment with the General Secretary. I resolved to be on good behavior. The elevator whisked us up to the 17th floor. We were anticipated, but our welcome was tepid. Nobody seemed glad to see us. It seemed odd. I hadn't expected hostility. A secretary handed us a sheaf of questionnaires, and we dutifully filled in the pages, just the facts, none of the emotions. No place to mention danger or fear or disappointment or privation. Do you want me to go on?
That's a good place to stop.
Is that enough?
Yeah.
You get
it. The reason I picked up on that section is that the institutional church doesn't come out looking too good in your memoir, and I think appropriately so. You give a very honest account of your experience with it. You know, how did your relationship to the church change through your experience?
I had to redefine church. And church now means to me this congregation, this staff, this building, this group. And I found a good placement for myself in what I call the church, which is the congregation. And the congregational church is very, very, it's much looser. I mean, Methodist Church have bishops. Can you imagine? That's medieval. And Presbyterians claim they have no structure, but don't listen to them. They're almost as bad as the Methodists in listening to the individuals who are trying to reach them with the problems of the individual. No, we'll take care of it. And that really helped because it allowed me to express a an emotion of love for a group of people and for an institution. So this is the best church I ever belonged to. The people in this church are interested in making not only a better world, but a better environment around us. And that my particular cause today, the Adult Mission Group, is a group of delightful people from this church who set out every summer on a mission to rehab houses after disasters. Now, you'll see the purple T-shirts. Kathy's got one, and Jane's wearing hers. But I had the privilege of going with this group of people 4 or 5 times. We went to New Orleans after the big flood. We were in Nashville for the flood, and we could tell you about our encounters with water moccasins in Nashville. And my favorite one was up just up the road here at Bend. Is that right? And in this case, instead of sleeping in the church basement, we were, one of the members of the church had a beautiful vacation home, which she turned over to us. And we looked out that Mount Shasta was framed in the window. It was gorgeous. Of course, that was my favorite. And Kathy is always the chef, and she not only works all day pounding and hammering, but then she prepares beautiful meals. And then in the evening, we'd play games and sing songs and do silly things. And it was the most fun I ever had in church. So I thought that's, I can't really physically do it anymore. The last one I went on, they found a job for me. I cleaned the paintbrushes, and the painters loved it. I could give them a clean paintbrush every time. But I've kind of worn out my ability to, I don't suppose I could even do that now. But it's every Sunday morning, we say something, Ben, that means everything to be, you say, and we will do this with, find this in, and the whole congregation says, in action. I'm a great believer in action for good causes. So to have this all built in already was just my thing.
Before we open it up to the folks who are here to ask other questions, I have one more question for you. It's a theological question. I'm just wondering if you've thought about how God's hand might have been present.
How?
God's hand.
Yeah.
God's presence, the movement of the Spirit. Can you think of a moment or some moments in your experience in the Congo when you felt like you were experiencing God's presence or God's hand in your life?
Oh yes, we were delivered from danger many times that you couldn't account for it by explaining it. And the house that we lived in was so important to me. It was our home, and we lived in the same house in the same town during the years that we were there. And there were many times when we had to pack up and leave in a hurry because the soldiers were acting up again, or there was danger. And every time we came back, I'd wonder if our home was still there, and there it would be. We had our faithful servant, Baba Samuel, who was a remarkable character and did all the things I didn't want to do and kept the house in good shape. And I can't say he's part of the family because it isn't that relationship. He was always there welcoming us back. And that to me is a sort of miracle because other missionaries lost their homes, other missionaries lost their lives. We were more fortunate than most of them, and I've never had a problem with God. I've had a big problem with the church, not the congregation here, but the church. But am I answering your question at all?
Yeah, you are.
I feel like
I hear that you experience the hand of God in deliverance and in experiences that you couldn't explain any other way, and also in the presence of helpers and friends who were there with you.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Thank you.
But my theology is different from many of the missionaries. The ones who were, I wasn't there to save souls. And that was a travesty to the missionaries who were there to save souls. So I had to, I had to be pretty careful. That's one of the reasons I was so good at hostessing and feeding people. I thought, well, this is one thing I can do for them, stay in their good graces. Someone who'd known me quite a while said, there's all this cooking in the book. Yeah, well, that's what I did. I could. But I feel that I've wandered away from your question.
No, you've answered it.
Did I?
Right on, yes.
Oh, good for me.
I'm
All right.
very happy with that. I wonder whether we could kind of open it up to the folks who are here in the room who might have questions. And I think Pastor Rachel will come to you with a microphone so that we can hear you.
I'm just wondering what you learned from the people that you had gone there to serve. Did you learn from them?
Yes. Yes. I learned what remarkable people they are. The people of the Congo suffered things we can't even imagine. As long as early on, when the Belgians took over the Congo and forced labor and mutilated the workers if they didn't produce enough rubber. It's a terrible story. You can read Adam Hochschul's book, King Leopold's Ghost, and you'll get a pretty good idea of what it was like. Yeah.
So, Rosemary, I've always been a real admirer of yours. I do have a comment on the trip to Bend, Oregon. If it was Bend, Oregon, it would. Oh, okay, it was Weed. Okay, I was going to say it was probably Mount Bachelor. If it was Bend. Anyway, my question is, who's the lady in the red dress? Is that you? On the cover of your book?
Oh, you're asking me who did the cover? I'm so glad you asked. My granddaughter did that. Her name is Caitlin Ottinger. She's a graduate of Middlebury and a professional designer and a good buddy of mine. And so she found a vintage photograph with that 30-foot anthill in it, added me in the picture, and voila. I'm so glad you asked me, right.
Okay, Martha.
I'm her daughter, Martha. And actually, that is a slide that was taken in Africa that we saw.
I'm not hearing you.
It's a slide that was taken in Africa, and that is of you.
Okay.
So,
I couldn't hear.
She said it was a slide taken in Africa and that is of you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Martha. Right.
Okay, here's a scary question.
Yeah.
I think the missionary work going to communities that have been burned out and helping is just wonderful. But I wonder how you feel today, Rosemary, about missionaries going to other places in the world and working with people whose faith has been different. How do you feel about that kind of missionary work today? And if that's not a fair question and you don't want to answer, just say so.
I think things are so different now. We were at the very end of that surge that swept through the Protestant church and the Catholic church in America, the world for Christ. And there was an outpouring of people and money and just, it was like the tide came in and then the tide went out. And I may be wrong about this, but I think there's not nearly as much emphasis on mission work, on conversion, on saving foreign souls, and that sort of thing. And you can't help but admire the people who believe that enough to go out there and do it. But on the other hand, to me, it often seemed like a lack of respect for the people who had gotten along pretty well without missionaries from America, and maybe it may be better. I write in the book about Pastor Joab, who became a good friend of mine. He was an old person, very much respected. He said he spoke 21 languages and nobody was going to doubt him. And we had a lot of long conversations, and he was the only African who would joke around with me. He would say funny things. We were at ease with each other enough to do that. And I thought he was perfectly fine just the way he was. You know, I didn't want to change anything about him. I wanted to change some things about myself when I saw the obstacles that he'd overcome. But the African people are strong, and they've suffered things that we can't even imagine. They still are suffering. We forgot about them when we were passing out the vaccine for the pandemic, and now there's a whole new one in Africa that started out, and again, we're scared to death of it for ourselves. We should be a little more, in my opinion, conscious of the people around the world who are in such great need. See, I'm still a missionary. I can't help it. Yeah.
Rosemary, I just finished reading your book, and something that just touched me was your concern about you being the parent of your children and not sending them to boarding school. And for some reason, that just grabbed me. I thought, good for Rosemary. But how are your kids, especially your boys now, how do they feel about all of it now, I guess, is what I want to know.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you, so I'll go to my translator. Right?
Oh, maybe this will help.
That's better.
Okay.
Okay, yes.
Something that really touched me in your book was your determination to parent your kids, not to send them off to boarding school, to keep them close, to expose them to everything that you could, but yet the idea of sending the boys off to that boarding school was just, I wanted to cry while I'm reading it. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, how do your kids feel about all of this now? And I know this is many years later, and I'm just a little more about that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we've all done things we wish we hadn't done. And I wish that I could have figured out some way that I didn't have to send those boys away to boarding school. My option was to take the children and go to the States, and the Board of Mission would have bought us tickets home, and they would have kept me on some kind of salary for 6 months. But that didn't seem a viable option. I was a teacher, and I had accreditation to teach in the state of Kansas, which might still have worked. But my parents weren't in a position to take us in, and I couldn't honestly see how I could take 4 children back to the States and make it in some way with it. And I have a lot of guilt about having to send the boys away. I could say I didn't have a choice, but none of the choices were good. And then when I learned that my oldest son had been physically mistreated by the director of the school, and this was a school for missionary children, and all the people were religious, and to have that kind of callous behavior toward children, I never could figure out how a person could do that. Mm-hmm. You know, so I have a lot of angst about that. I don't think the boys suffered as much as they might have. They claim now pretty much that they had a good time, but I'll just touch on this and I won't get into it. research was done in a Presbyterian church to reveal that the children of missionaries in these hostels were being physically mistreated by the missionaries who were in local parentis. And it was the Presbyterians who first brought this to light. And it took the Methodists about 5 years before they publicized. They were, the two denominations were working together on this investigation. The Presbyterians published, the Methodists didn't. And I was one of the people who was harassing the Methodists that you owe it to all of us to own up to what happened. It's never been, very few people know about it. I don't know if they should know about it or not, but it was a frightening thing because that was the school that my boys would have gone to next. And that, that's pretty grim. And maybe I shouldn't have told you that, but the truth always comes out someplace. Yeah.
Any other?
I could sense as a mother to know, in order to keep my kids safe or whatever, to have to send them there would tear you apart. And I just appreciate you sharing that, that you were willing to, that you said it. And I just, oh, Rosemary, that must, I could just feel it in my heart for you. So.
Well, I kept setting the table for 6.
Great.
I just had a hard time letting go of it. And then when the crisis came, that they wanted all 4 of our children, and that was that wasn't going to happen. And the language they used, the headmaster said to me several times, "Yes, we'd like to get them young so we could break them to the system." No. Not my little girls, no. Oh.
You wrote of many health scares and real problems that you had, and traveling in this century, it always is on my mind, am I going to be safe somewhere medically? And what you went through with so many female issues, I'm just so glad to see you at this age made it, and that you were like discounted by the seriousness by your husband and again many of the men in that system.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you're healthy.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm here. It was some very serious things happened physically, and I didn't always get the best care. But enough. I mean, I survived, yeah. Yeah. Glad I did.
She said just the trip to get there was harrowing enough.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a story.
Any other questions? I had a final question.
Of course.
So your first book,
Yes.
Your first book was called Kusoma Furaha,
Kusoma Furaha.
in Swahili for a literacy campaign.
Yes.
That was in 1960.
Yes.
Your second book is called Turn Left at the Big Ant Hill, a memoir published in 2021.
Right.
What's your next project?
Thank you. I've been looking, through some things that I'd written along the way, particularly some things I wrote. I did a master's degree in writing and literature at Bennington in Vermont. I was in my 70s. It was a remote learning. You go there for a while, and then you go home and write. And I was looking through some of the things I wrote then, and I thought I might do, authors do a thing called a chapbook. they collect their stories and they publish them in some charming little manner and present them to their grandchildren and that sort of thing. It's kind of a vanity thing, but I'll try that. Now, the people in my memoir class will let me know right away if that's a good idea or not, because we're so tight in that class and we know each other so well that we're good at that sort of thing. But I don't know. There are a couple of stories that I'd like to write. I'd like to write about my mother, some family stories. But I don't think I'll do any more memoir. Memoir is the thing now. Everybody's writing a memoir, and the people writing memoirs have children. And usually their children are unhappy about the memoir, and then the children are writing a memoir, and the parents are having a fit. I never did that. So it's interesting to see the differences of opinion about memoir.
It's easier than talking to each other. You just might write memoirs about each other. Yeah.
You're right. I never thought about that. That's right.
I meant that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but maybe, I don't know.
Well, I think you and pity the children of the memoirist. It's not easy. And if it's children writing a memoir, pity the parents. My daughter Mary is writing her story, but she's writing the story of her childhood. It's interesting, she started this in the 6th grade. And she started asking me questions. Where were we? When? How long did that last? And I said, Mary, these are your memories, and you must keep them separate from my memories, because the precious part of it is they're yours. So she's turning into a pretty good writer and memoirist, and we'll see what she thinks of her parents now that her parents have revealed what we think she was. So it's a dance. An intricate dance, and you try to make it so nobody gets hurt. But there was something I found just a couple of days ago I wanted to read to you. I read memoirs all the time because that's one of the ways you find out how to do it. And I came upon this little gem in this, I picked up here it is on this book. I didn't even write down the reference. Here's the sentence. Whatever the facts, my mother had shared the truth. Now, that wasn't written about me. That was another memoirist writing about her mother. And I'm sorry I didn't bring the reference so I could tell you about it. It's not nice to steal something like that and not identify it. But I think there's a lot to that. There's the facts and then the truth. One other thing I wanted to say, I was writing from letters that we wrote every week with what I thought were the facts. And those letters didn't always tell the truth. I'd say something like, oh yes, the soldiers were out again and the United Nations soldiers were causing trouble, but we're fine. We weren't fine. And my mother and father and all these other relatives were smart enough to know that wasn't the truth. They were the facts, but not, you see the distinction I'm making? And oftentimes, the truth gets lost in the facts. Yeah. So memoir, it's one of the things memoirists learn. One of the things.
Well, Rosemary, on behalf of all of us, congratulations on the publication of your book. And we are so grateful to all who had a hand in encouraging Rosemary to write this.
Thank you for coming.
And I think could we all just together congratulate her and celebrate this publication?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure.
It's wonderful.
Ben, you're great to do this.
Well, thank you.
You asked good questions.
It was a pleasure. And I think the next instruction is that there are books for sale in the back and also a reception to which you are all invited. Did you have other things that you wanted to announce? So thanks who joined us here in person. Thanks to you who are watching this online. And one more time, thank you to Rosemary Manchester, author of Turn Left at the Big Anthill. Congratulations and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you.